You know, for as long as people have looked up at the stars, there's been this one huge question that just hangs in the air. Where is the proof of God? And today, in our super scientific world, that question is sharper than ever. It's like we've got this standoff between the demand for hard, cold data and the quiet conviction of faith. So today, we're going to dive right into that tension.
Right, let's just get straight to the heart of it with this question. This isn't just some abstract puzzle for philosophers to chew on. For a lot of people, this is a really personal, really significant challenge. It pretty much frames the entire modern debate about how we know what we think we know.
So first things first, we got to understand the modern challenge to belief. And what it really boils down to is this demand for what's called empirical evidence. Basically, that just means proof that we can see, measure, and test for ourselves, scientifically.
And this quote just captures that feeling perfectly, doesn't it? The argument is pretty straightforward. If God is real and actually does things in our universe, then those actions should leave some kind of footprint, right? They should be detectable. And since science is our best tool for detecting stuff in the universe, the question becomes, where's the signal?
The philosophy that drives this whole line of thinking is called scientific empiricism. And the core principle is really simple. Knowledge should come from things we can experience with our senses and verify. If you can't measure it, test it, or repeat it in a lab, then from this point of view, its existence is, well, questionable at best.
Now this is where things get really interesting. Science is absolutely brilliant at answering the how questions. How does gravity bend space-time? How do our cells replicate? But the sources we're looking at today argue that science was never really designed to tackle the big, metaphysical why questions. Why are there laws of nature in the first place? Is there any meaning to all of this?
And that leads to this really sophisticated philosophical challenge called the argument from divine hiddenness. And this is a fascinating twist in the whole debate. The argument isn't just that there's no evidence for God. It goes a step further and says that the very lack of obvious, in-your-face evidence is itself evidence against a certain type of God, specifically a perfectly loving one.
And this is the gut-punch question that the argument poses. If God is all-loving and wants a relationship with us, then why the hide and seek? Why would God leave sincere people who are genuinely open to believing, in a state of doubt? It's a really powerful question, and it sets the stage for a completely different way of thinking about what evidence could even be.
So how do you respond to that? Well, the answer from the Islamic perspective in our sources doesn't try to offer up a lab experiment. Instead, it completely reframes the whole idea of what we should be looking for when we talk about evidence.
The central concept here is a word from the Quran, ayats, which literally means signs. And the idea is that proof of God isn't some rare one-time miracle that breaks the laws of physics. No, the signs are supposed to be constant, continuous, and all around us, woven right into the fabric of reality and the laws of nature themselves.
So the Quran actually invites people to look at the world with a scientific eye, to really think about things we now understand in incredible detail, like the beautiful complexity of the water cycle, or the predictable, amazing stages of how an embryo develops, or the invisible ozone layer protecting us. These things aren't presented as mysteries, but as observable, ordered systems that point to an intelligent designer.
And this is a really crucial point. This approach avoids that old trap called the God of the gaps, where people say, well, science can't explain that, so it must be God. This is the total opposite. The argument here is God of the laws. It suggests that the more we actually understand the laws of science, the more we can see a sign of a lawgiver behind it all. So, this brings us to a kind of synthesis. What we're really looking at are two very different ways of knowing, two different approaches to understanding the world. One is through repeatable experiments and hard data, and the other is through interpreting the signs and patterns we see in the universe.
From the theological perspective, the argument is that demanding physical proof for a non-physical reality is what philosophers call a category error. It's just using the wrong tool for the job. Like this slide says, it's like trying to measure the color of a thought. You wouldn't use a thermometer to measure distance, and this view argues you shouldn't use a physics experiment to try and measure God. So that brings us back full circle to that big question, why would God be so subtle? Why the hiddenness? Well, this slide lays out the theological logic, step by step. It starts with this idea of undeniable proof. Imagine if the evidence for God was as obvious as gravity. Well, then belief wouldn't be a choice, would it? It would be forced. That leads to step 2, coerced belief. And if we're forced to believe, we lose our free will. And if we lose free will, well, then the whole idea of morality just kind of falls apart. Good and evil don't mean much if you can't freely choose between them.
And this idea of choice is absolutely central in Islamic theology. The sources really emphasize that life is seen as a test. And what's the foundation of any real test? The freedom to choose your own answer. And for that freedom to be real, there needs to be what some philosophers call epistemic distance, basically a gap in knowledge between us and God. That gap creates just enough room for genuine doubt, which is what makes genuine, freely chosen belief possible and meaningful.
This distinction right here is key to seeing how these two worldviews can potentially fit together. A scientist uses what's called methodological naturalism. For their work, they assume there are only natural causes, because that's what you can test. But that's a tool, not a final statement about reality. That's totally different from metaphysical naturalism, which is the actual belief that nature is all there is, period. So one is a practical tool for doing science, the other is a full-blown worldview.
So, at the end of the day, it all comes down to this question. It reframes the whole debate. This isn't just about finding one piece of data in a lab anymore. It's about how we choose to interpret everything. Is the entire universe just a silent, random accident? Or is it more like a symphony, a meaningful text filled with signs just waiting for us to learn how to read them? According to the sources we've looked at, the answer really depends on which lens you choose to look through.